Good day, people. So I'm going to try to do a little bit of a shout out to Kenneth Burke today. I'm going to try to talk about his chapter called Definition of Man from his book Language as Symbolic Action. So if you haven't seen that book, please go check it out. Go get that chapter, and maybe that way some of this will make a little bit more sense. Some things to say about Kenneth Burke, I think, just right off the bat, is to say he's an amazing character. He was self-educated. I think he did maybe 2 semesters in college. I think he went to Ohio and I think Ohio and Columbia for like a semester each. Found university study too constraining and too confining for him, but he eventually went on and basically created an entire school of study that he called dramatism, right? The study of language as a mode of action. But yeah, Burke was a Shakespeare scholar, was a biblical scholar, had command over French, German, could read some Latin and some Greek. He was quite famous early on in his career with an essay called "The Rhetoric of Hitler's Battle," where he had noticed he had read Hitler's Mein Kampf, and he had noticed Hitler's repeated use of the word vermin, and he predicted very bad things. And when the Nazis stormed Poland, he really did look somewhat prophetic. He looked like he had a crystal ball. And when people asked him how he did it, well, he said, I just followed out the motives that were implied in the language. And that's, I guess, a really another important point to make about Burke is that Burke is a motives scholar. He's very interested in the way that the world of human action is one that's filled with motives. And he does have the book called A Grammar of Motives and one called A Rhetoric of Motives, which are also both worth checking out. I think one of the things to say real quickly about motives, too, is that for Burke, a motive isn't something that's in the head. It's partly a symptom of the language practices, but it's also the shorthand of a situation. So when we try to understand motivation, we use words like jealousy or envy or rage or fear. But for Burke, they're partly, I guess, names of physiological states, but they're also, I guess, shorthands for situation. So if you say someone committed a murder, and if you say, well, we did it out of fear versus they did it out of jealousy versus they did it out of anger, we can't help but imagine a different situation in each case. So we're not just understanding the motivation from an inward sense, but from a joint meeting of social and psychological factors. Okay, that said, so Burke's definition of man, and it's a 5 clauses that are all strung together. And the first clause is man is the symbol-using, symbol-making, symbol-misusing animal. Second one is inventor of, invented by the negative. Third one is separated from natural conditions by instruments of his own making. Fourth, goaded by the spirit of hierarchy or moved by the sense of order. And then lastly, it's rotten with perfection. And all 5 of these they're integrated into one another, and you can really only get at Burke's definition by seeing how each clause is expanded upon, how it's holding so much more than just that little summary statement, but that each of the clauses is related to all of the other ones. So I'm going to start with this notion of that man is the symbol-using, symbol-making, symbol-misusing animal. Now, in some way, Burke is suggesting that all reality, and it's like with a capital R, in some way is mediated through human symbol use and symbol making and symbol misusing. And he gives so many different examples, but I thought it would be helpful to maybe just read this one passage here. This is a paragraph that begins on page 5. Okay, so he says, the symbol using animal, yes, obviously. But can we bring ourselves to realize just what that formula implies? Just how overwhelmingly much of what we mean by reality has been built up for us through nothing but our symbol systems? Take away our books, and what little do we know about history, biography, or even something so down to earth as the relative position of seas and continents? what is our reality for today beyond the paper-thin line of our own particular lives, but all this clutter of symbols about which the past combined with whatever things we know mainly through maps, magazines, newspapers, and the like about the present. In school, as they go from class to class, students turn from one idiom to another. In various courses in the curriculum are in effect but so many different terminologies. And however important to us is the tiny sliver of reality each of us has experienced firsthand, the whole overall picture is but a construct of our symbol systems. To meditate on this fact until one sees its full implications is much like peering over the edge of things into an ultimate abyss. And doubtless that's one reason why, though man is typically the symbol-using animal, he clings to a kind of naive verbal realism that refuses to realize the full extent of the role played by symbolicity in his notions of reality. So yeah, Burke, again, he claims that most people, without realizing it, they adhere to a kind of naive verbal realism. They imagine that there are things just in the world, and then as a happenstance, there are also a set of words, almost like they're labels to refer to those things. And in that sense, people, they largely underestimate how pervasive language is, and it's more of a condition than an activity. It's not that we're occasionally using language. It's the condition of trying to tell what's going on, right? I mean, Burke really cuts at this in wonderful ways. He says, in being a link between us and the nonverbal, words are by the same token a screen separating us from the nonverbal, though that statement gets tangled in its own traces, since so much of the we that is separated from the nonverbal by the verbal would not even exist were it not for the verbal, right? So it is funny. I think people like to say, well, I don't mean just speech, I mean reality. And then it's funny because, well, that's another word, reality. And I think we like to imagine that we can say what's independent of language. Now, are there things independent of language? I think there are, but you can't say what those are. As soon as you start to say what they are, now you've pulled them into that realm of discourse, that realm of I guess, of symbols in the way that we think we understand something when we're able to put it into some symbol, some picture, some words. Burke, in a lot of ways, he's talking about ideology, and he suggests that languages they're like ideologies in their own right, that to learn a language is to get co-opted by a certain perspective. He says it sort of makes bodies hop around in certain ways once they've acquired a particular language. And the primary resource here that Burke is talking about is a kind of substitution, where one thing can be substituted for something else. And this is the basic process, that if you have a symbol is such that it's substitutable. It can be replaced by something else. So simple translation, one language can be translated into another language. Mathematical expressions, if I take any mathematical expression, I can rewrite that lots of different ways. The idea that words stand for things, I look at a menu, and the items on the menu, they're substituting for the things that will come to me when I order them. There's so many different ways to get at this issue of substitution. And Burke wants to talk about these subsets of abbreviation and condensation and displacement. So in some way, abbreviation is really the key, that when we talk about substitution, oftentimes we substitute a title for a larger book or something. We'll take something that's highly abbreviated, and that's a kind of summation. So instead of saying my chair and my table and my lamp, I can just say the word furniture. Or instead of talking about my brother or my uncle or my aunt, I can talk about family or relatives. Words allow one to say something in other words, and oftentimes we do so in a kind of condensed way. So people are able to sum up things, and they'll say, oh, well, my life this, or I had a bad week, or they're able to use symbols in a very condensed way. Burke sort of gives the example of, if I say, hey, let's build a fire. Hey, let's build a fire is such an easy thing to say, but it involves so much more than that. It's sort of like if I say, well, let's make a lasagna dinner. We could say, let's make a lasagna dinner, but all of the actions and the activities and the related items that are going to go into that, right? That's sort of what we're after. Now, I guess what's sort of key here is that for Burke, again, this is all related to motive, because there is this sense of substitution that's embedded within, I guess, moral systems, legal systems. I mean, it is kind of interesting when you ask the question about what is the adequate penalty and or fine for a wrongdoing. So Burke's going to talk about victimage and revenge and punishment, and he is partly in the backdrop doing some of this like biblical work. Like he's interested in the stories of the Bible. Now, Burke himself was an agnostic. He did not, he's not like a theist here in giving his argument about the Garden of Eden, but he thinks it's an interesting story, at least from the narrative perspective, that supposedly the two first people, again, depending on which version you get, but the first two people, Adam and Eve, they do something wrong. That is, they eat from this tree that the Lord says don't eat from. They do, and then all subsequent people have to be punished for their wrongdoing. And then Christ, God's Son, gets made flesh, and in Christ living, dying as he does, that somehow makes amends for original sin and saves everyone else. Now, the story itself is rich with symbolic substitutions, and there is, but there is for Burke an interesting sense in which all legal systems, all moral systems work on very similar principles. Imagine just the simple case of someone comes up and they hit you. Now, how is hitting them back justice? I mean, there was one event that happened at one point, and then there was another event at another point. But many people, again, not all, some people would say, well, yeah, justice has been served. Well, if we say justice has been served, we're somehow living in a symbolic world of things being substitutable, of one thing standing in for another thing, right? Some person commits a crime and they can either do X number of days in jail or they can pay this amount of money. It's odd how a given act has then other acts which are seen to be proper punishment and or justice in the wake of it. It's very symbolic, right? And I think for Burke, he kind of rounds out that first clause by talking about forms of transcendence. When he's talking about transcendence, he's really trying to say that people are able to move into new states. They're able to move into, I guess, new realms of consciousness as they symbolically substitute one thing for another. And this often happens in forms of art and catharsis. So some person who's struggling with a particular issue in their own life, they may watch a representation of something very similar to that on a television show or maybe in a play, and somehow they're able to use that artistic medium to face their own quandaries, and in such a way that it has a catharsis. It emotionally releases some of their anxiety or their stress, and through a kind of symbolic substitution, they transcend their current state. Now, Burke also adds that a lot of times there's symbol misuse, that people can they can be physiologically revulsed at the idea of something. And he gives this example of a guy who thought he was eating blubber. He was up in the Eskimo community, and he thought he was eating blubber, and he ran out, and just the thought of it made him sick. And then this woman was outraged this Eskimo woman was outraged that she wasn't included for the blubber meal. And she went in and she came out all disappointed, saying, well, it's just dumplings. And Burke's point was that, people can form visceral reactions about things just from the words about them, from what they've heard about them. And this is also, I think, very true when he's talking about, he calls it demagogic spellbinders. He says that people are often able to demonize others. They're able to talk about others in such a way that they create in their listeners a kind of fantastic hatred about people that they don't know at all. The only way they know them is through various symbols. I mean, even this right here, right now, it sounds like it's me here talking about Burke, but this is a recording. In some way, this is a symbolic representation of an event that happened many days ago, I guess, by the time you're listening to it. Okay, so that's the first symbol, that's the first clause, right? Man is a symbol using, symbol making, symbol misusing animal. Now the second one here is very related to it. You want to see these as continuing out and part of the same overall definition, right? Even though they're different clauses, they're much more related than you would think perhaps at first pass. But he says inventor of, and then he has in brackets invented by the negative. Okay, so now Burke wants to say that humans uniquely have invented the negative. And by that he means that we're able to think about and deal with what's not the case. And it includes things like zero, and it includes all the different ways of saying what is not. But Burke wants to say that it's strange to in some ways suggest that humans invented the negative any more than saying that humans invented language. For Burke, in some way, language was a natural organic process that kind of invented humans, and even more so, he'd say that the negative resources within language are what help precipitate humans into the conscious states that they currently experience. So his first point is basically that there are no negatives in nature. So when you walk around in nature, nature is fully, wholly what it is. It's positive at all points. But once you introduce symbolicity, now you can have non-paradoxical senses of negativity infecting the world. So one of his examples is if I say, is it 54 degrees out? Now if I ask that question, is it 54 degrees out? If it's any degree other than 54, you can correctly, truthfully say it's not 54 degrees. But there's no such thing as being not 54. It's either 75 or it's 38 or it's the particular temperature that it is. But once I'm able to ask the question, we're able to deal with what's, quotes, not the case. Now, Burke says you got to look out. He's very suspicious of a lot of these existentialists, and he starts to pick on people like Sartre and Heidegger, and he says that these folks will start to hoodwink you. They'll get all mystical about the nothingness, and they'll imagine that there is some kind of non-being. Burke, he kind of haggles for less, and he says, I don't need to get into this sort of metaphysical speculation about non-being. He sort of says these are problems for other people. He's more interested in what he claims is that the hortatory don't precedes or is both temporally and logically prior to the is not. Again, the hortatory don't. That is, the admonishment of no or don't. This is the basis of I guess this is where the negativity really starts. This is where it gets off the ground. And the child is drenched in a flurry of thou shalt nots, of don'ts. And what Burke wants to suggest is that a kind of temporal clearing opens up in the lapse between the command and its obedience. So whereas nature seems to have, I guess, either no commands or no obedience, or what Burke would say is that the command and obedience are at the same time. These are sort of what he's talking about when he's talking about physical laws or the salivation of Pavlov's dog. But he says that in the human realm, because of symbols and because of the capacity to make substitutions and displacements, people are able to give a command at one time and then have the obeyance or fail to obey that command at another time. And it's that very distance between the command and obedience where character emerges, so says Burke. So Burke wants to say that people can be of good conscience or bad conscience, and it's how they experience themselves. But again, they're of good conscience or bad conscience, or they feel of noble character or a foul character by how well they're able to adhere or not to their own culture's thou shalt nots. He'll sometimes talk about it as the Mosaic Decalogue, and if you see that expression, the Mosaic Decalogue basically means the Ten Commandments. And his point here is that, just take children. The children are exposed to lines like, thou shalt not commit adultery. Now, they're not even having sex yet. They might not even know what sex is, but they're told, do not commit adultery. They're told, do not steal. And they're told this before they're really having the opportunity to do it, but they're setting up the conditions for moral action, right? For Burke, that there is a kind of morality that grows out of the negativity that's buried in language, so that people they're able to engage in what he calls quasi-positives. Now, a quasi-positive is an act that if you were just looking at it, it seems to be wholly what it is, and yet it's behind the scenes, guided by, and it's motivated by consciously accepted vows or promises or commands. So a person who says that they're a vegetarian, we'll say, well, they don't eat meat. But there's no way to see someone not eating meat. You see them eat whatever they eat. Now, maybe someone puts some meat in front of them and they push it to the side. Well, we don't know, are they already full or did they not eat meat? So you can't see someone not doing something. If some person says, I'm not smoking, well, there's some people who are non-smokers. What's the difference between a non-smoker who's not smoking and someone who's a smoker who's not smoking? Well, neither of them, quotes, are smoking. But if you try to look at the actual acts, there seems to be a significant difference between someone who's consciously not doing something and someone who's just doing whatever they're doing, right? Again, Burke calls it quasi-positives, where people will regulate their behavior by obeyance to some admonishment of what not to do. And this is where he does introduce this notion of action motion. He wants to say that humans, symbolic creatures, right, they're able to act in addition to just be in motion. And Burke will say that there can be motion without action, as in the physical thrashing of the waves. There cannot be action without motion. So again, motion is a necessary but not sufficient condition. But then he says action is not reducible to the terms of motion. That is, action is motion plus motive. So there's a kind of motivation in motion that makes it action, so says Burke. And part of the way he gets at this is he suggests that all moral terms are polar. Now, if I can get at that a little bit more. To say that all moral terms are polar is, for Burke, he wants to make a distinction between words which refer to things that are, so table, chair, rock, tree. There are things that are just there, and the words seem to be positive, where there are other words that are loaded with the moral weight of negativity, and these would be words like clean or healthy or right or just or strong. See, I think words that have opposites, words that are polar. Now, not every word that is polar is moral, but every moral word is polar, so says Burke. That is, you can't find a word that means something like the untable or the anti-table or the non-tree. They're just, things are what they are. But when you get to justice, justice is related to injustice, or chaos is related, inversely to order, or good is, it has a kind of opposite, which is bad or wrong, right? And so Burke's going to again say that the human world is one that it bristles with moral life, partly because people are so drenched in symbols that set the conditions for good and bad conscience by demanding, setting up lots of cultural thou shalt nots that people then they resonate with those in various responses, right? If they were able to live up to their culture's thou shalt nots, they'll feel pretty good about themselves. And if they continuously make promises that they fail to live up to, they'll feel a kind of bad conscience. Now, I guess the last point about the inventor of and invented by the negative is that Burke, which he always has such a great sense of humor about all this, he wants to say that part of the point of language is that it's so infected with negativity that you have to have a sense of the word not being the thing, or of the map not being the territory, to even use words at all. And to that extent, there's a kind of irony or humor that's built into language. So Burke would want to say that you're really not at home in a language until you can use it ironically, or until you're comfortable in the humor, for example, of a language. But so much of humor, so much of what people think of as funny, is stating what's not the case. If someone says, wow, your shoes they're gigantic, they're caverns, or if somebody says, that's a cocktail you could take a swim in, they're dramatic overstatements. Again, it's a kind of substitution, but they're meant ironically and humorously by saying what's not the case. Okay, the next clause, I gotta speed this up here a little bit. So the next clause is separated from natural conditions by instruments of our own making. And here Burke he's trying to suggest that humans are more than just a tool making animal. They're an animal that has made tools to make tools, and in some way they have created the very conditions that have now separated themselves out, that people have so substituted their moral orders, their overall sense of the world, that with the natural conditions, whatever those might be, that now people are more comfortable in their own human-made environments. So, most people, they feel most comfortable when they're clothed, when they're in their apartments, when they're already in dwellings that they have some sort of control over. Burke gives a sort of interesting example. So he lived in a farm out in New Jersey, and when there was a New York power outage, and it was reported the next day in the papers that when the power outage happened, it was close to a catastrophe in New York. It was a lot of panic, and people weren't sure what to do. Whereas Burke, he kind of lived a little bit like a Luddite. He didn't really have electricity put into his house till later. He liked the outhouse. He was a very kind of anti-tech guy. But he commented on how he didn't even notice, right? When the power went out, I guess it also went out in New Jersey, and it meant no difference to him. And the point would be that, what could be more natural than it being dark at night? And yet, for people who had become accustomed to live in the city, it was quite a panic. And I think for Burke, this, we could get at this in so many ways when talking about literacy and all the ways that the Industrial Revolution has really altered, I guess, people's sense of what is natural and what is not. Okay, so the next one I got here is goaded by the spirit of hierarchy or moved by the sense of order. Yeah, Burke has so much stuff on order and hierarchy. Some of this would be, we can do a couple of videos on just this point, that when Burke says hierarchy, he's partly talking about hierarchical arrangements, I guess, somewhat similar to socio-political class and status, and there are issues of beauty hierarchies and power hierarchies and ways that people interpersonally and sociopolitically sort of do one's upmanship and someone else's sort of lower on the rung. But he's more interested, and that's all part of it, but he's more interested in the way that ideas can have logical priority, and that there's always this problem of firsts, of what's the first principle. And so when he talks about moved by the sense of order, order itself is a very interesting word. It's ambiguous. And Burke's a real master of ambiguity. He often say, the task is not to rid ourselves of ambiguity, but to be able to point to the places where ambiguity necessarily arises. So Burke's really interested in ambiguity, but order is one of these places. The word order. See, sometimes the word order is a command, and you say to someone, go do this, and you're ordering them to do X, Y, or Z. And that's one of the meanings of order. But order also has, I guess, a meaning of there's an orderliness to something. That is, something is in order rather than chaotic, or rather than just random or a mismatch or in a pile. We say, no, it's in order. But there's also, even within the notion of it being an order, there is a order of operation. That there's a kind of sequence that one begins in order to put the order in its order, right? There seem to be multiple ways in which ordering is not only, again, a command and an arrangement, but it's a beginning somewhere and ending somewhere in order to get the arrangement in its proper order. And so I guess what Burke wants to suggest here is that there are lots of ways in which people think the world should be. They have sensibilities about what comes first, what is to be prioritized over what. And this largely has to do with values, over which is a higher value. Is liberty a higher value than life? Is equity more important than justice? I mean, there are different ways where people, I guess, try to classify and hierarchically prioritize the values that they're going to use to build their life around. But for Burke, it's partly a source of mystery and partly a source of guilt, that people are unsure of, I guess, the orders that other people are living their lives by. And oftentimes there is what Burke calls the Song of the Scapegoat. So they'll give a promise, they'll give some belief that a certain order needs to exist. And you can start to see this in political campaign discourse. So much of Burke's work has been taken up by people who do political communication, and they study the way that politicians give promises to the people about what kind of order should be there. And then inevitably, the order, it doesn't live up to what the promise had been. It somehow fails. And from there, some sort of guilt gets generated, and then a need to remedy that. And this is, you can see how the thou shalt nots and the substitution all come back into this. So, political candidacies are just ripe with this person failed, and this is the reason why things are not as they're supposed to be. And Burke would say there's really two routes to deal with the kind of guilt that comes out of the failed order. One would be mortification. This is where the person says that the person recognizes that they're partly implicated in the failing of the order, and they try to correct and remedy as best they can. The other would be the scapegoat. And the Song of the Scapegoat, the cult of the kill, is, I guess, more often taken. So people will suggest that the world is not, or some political situation is not as it should be, or reality is not as it should be. Someone's life somehow hasn't had what was promised to it. And here the person sets out to blame something else, someone else, right? There's a kind of scapegoating that goes on. Now, Burke's not advocating one or the other, but I think he's very quick to point out that many people, because of their naive verbal realism and because of the motives that they have in trying to understand the world in a way that salvages their own sense of self, they're very easily called into scapegoating upon others to blame it, rather than, I guess, to try to understand some of the more complex reasons behind the shortcomings or the failings of people's of their larger lives. So the last point is the last clause of Burke's definition is rotten with perfection. And just to review here, right? This the actual definition is: man is the symbol-using, symbol-making, symbol-misusing animal, inventor of, invented by the negative, separated by natural conditions from instruments of its own making, goaded by the spirit of hierarchy, moved by the sense of order, and rotten with perfection. So this rotten with perfection is the last clause. And you can see here Burke both symbolically substituting a kind of negative expression and sort of combining them together. And I think he believes it's somewhat humorous. I think it is. He's trying to show the irony of the human condition of being rotten with perfection. Now, by perfection, he doesn't just mean trying to make things always perfect in the sense of trying to get everything in the order that will make it somehow right. But he is suggesting that there is a perfecting within organisms, and by perfecting, he's talking about the Aristotelian notion of entelechy or telos, that an organism, when given the opportunity, it will grow itself to its fullest level of development, to its fullest manifestation of the potentialities that were there. So the perfection of the acorn is the oak. Right, the oak is the telos or the entelechy that comes out of the acorn. And so what Burke is trying to suggest is that you can do intellectual analysis, which is partly what Burke was doing when he read Hitler's Mein Kampf, right? He was seeing how certain word choices, when pushed to the end of the line, mean, in this case, vermin. The end of the line of that was extermination, right? So what Burke would say is that we have a tendency to carry out the implications of our terms. That if you begin somewhere, like if you say something like, I'm uncomfortable by those people who are a little strange, the perfection of that is like, let's all kill the weirdos. You push something all the way to its where it will end up. This is why for Burke, especially in the dramatic arts, you need things like the perfect villain, the perfect fool, or the perfect problem. Burke talks about the perfect tragedy, and he talks about the death of a beautiful young woman, and he says, what could be more tragic? He's trying to talk about it being dramatically perfect in the sense of what could be more painful by our moral and aesthetic sensibilities. I guess he wants to say, and it's sort of his end admonishment. It's kind of his way of suggesting, be careful what you begin playing with, because you're going to end up at the destination that thing sort of carries you to. And so he thought that people were potentially on the, they were becoming roboticized. They're becoming made more and more automatons. And I think his own resistance to a lot of technology came from this recognition or fear that people, there won't be any way to stop the technology once it's opened far enough. And, you can sort of think about somebody who's constantly on their phone. I think if someone's constantly on their phone, for Burke, he's going to say, well, where is that going to be end of the line? When you push it to its extreme, I guess the only thing left for that person will be something like marrying a robot or bringing robotics so into the world that now they're able to get themselves off a line because the technologies of online have been brought into the real world. So at any rate, those are some things to say about Kenneth Burke's definition of man. Go check that essay out, and okay, have a great day. Bye-bye.